Hey, it's Mr. Estrada here, and at the end of this video, you should be able to say with certainty, I can reduce radicals with negative radicands. So remember, I is equal to radical negative 1. It is with this knowledge that we simplify radicals with negative radicands. Let's look at our first example. Fully simplify radical negative 32. So first thing I want you to do is to factor out a radical negative 1. So factor out a radical negative 1. That's the first thing you should do. So that means that we're going to rewrite radical negative 32 as radical negative 1 times radical 32. Well, what's radical negative 1? That's just I. And now we simplify the radical, 32. So radical 32 simplifies to radical 16 times radical 2. Then you simplify the perfect square. Square root of 16 is 4. So we have I times 4 times radical 2. And now we get 4I radical 2. So look, the basic idea is to factor out a radical negative 1 in the first step. And that's what we did here. Factored out a radical negative 1 right over here. And we do that to get rid of the negative under the radical. That's the important step. And then you know radical negative 1, that's just I. And then you should know how to work with regular radicals. And by regular, I mean, you know, a positive integer under the radical. Example 2. So now we have to fully simplify the product of two radicals which happen to have negative radicands. Now let me explain something here, and this is super important. This is very, very important. The rule radical A times radical B is equal to radical A times B. That rule does not apply when you're multiplying radicals with negative radicands. So I'm going to zoom into that, and you need to make sure that you understand that. Did I zoom in too much? Okay, let me bring it in here. I can't. Let me zoom out a little bit. There it is. So that's important. You need to know that. You need to understand that. Pause the video, read this, take a minute to understand it. Okay, now, since that rule doesn't apply, we got to simplify the radicals with negative radicands. And you know, luckily we've been over that already, right? So that means we got to simplify radical negative 30, and we're going to have to simplify radical negative 54, which has a coefficient of 7 there. Okay, so how do we simplify radical negative 30? Well, we're going to have to factor out a radical negative 1, like we did in the first example. And there isn't a perfect square other than 1 that goes into 30. So this is just going to simplify into I radical 30. Now let's simplify 7 radical negative 54. So we got a 7, coefficient of 7, can't forget about that, and radical negative 54, we're going to have to factor out the radical negative 1, and we could also factor the 54 now with radical 9 times radical 6. So what is that going to become? That's going to become 7 times I times 3 times radical 6. So the radical negative 1 becomes I, the radical 9 becomes 3, and then you just bring down the radical 6 and bring down the 7. Now we could rewrite it like this. We got I radical 30 multiplied by 21I radical 6. So now it's a multiplication problem again. Okay, now you have positive radicands. Do you see that? You got a positive 30 under the radical and you got a positive 6 under the radical. So now you could multiply the radicals. Not like in the beginning of the problem where you had negative numbers under the radical and you couldn't multiply them. That's not the case now. Now you could multiply. You could multiply coefficients with coefficients and radicands with radicands. So what do I mean by that? Well, I times 21I is going to be 21I squared. And radical 30 times radical 6 is going to be radical 180. So, let's continue. Simplify the radical 180. And remember that I squared equals negative 1 from the last video. So we get this. We're going to substitute negative 1 for I squared. Radical 180 simplifies to radical 36 times radical 5. And 21 times negative 1 is negative 21. Radical 36 simplifies to 6. And just bring down the radical 5. And now you multiply these together. Negative 21 times 6 gives you negative 126. Bring down the radical 5. And we're done. Try and zoom out so you can see the whole thing. Is it possible? There it is. All right, so remember, we could not multiply them off the bat because this rule here does not apply when you have negative radicands. You got to get rid of the negative radicand. So that's very important. Okay, you can't multiply radicals with negative radicands. You got to simplify them first. So you got to factor out that radical negative 1. Okay, I hope this video helps. Take care.